Assalamualaikum. Now, I'll be introducing our group's topic. International law is traditionally based on principle of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. This means that each state has control over its own territory and is only legally bound by rules or agreements that it has consented to. However, this system is increasingly being challenged by climate change. Issues such as rising sea levels and cross-border environmental damage have now threatened not only populations, but even the existence of some states, especially small island nations. Because of this, a key legal question arises. Can states be held responsible for climate-related harm even when there is no specific treaty in place? To address this issue, there are two main frameworks. Framework A focuses on treaty-based responsibility, where states are only bound by what they have agreed to. In contrast, Framework B argues that states have a customary responsibility to prevent environmental harm, even without a treaty. Therefore, this presentation will analyze which of these frameworks provides a stronger and fairer legal basis in addressing environmental responsibility in international law. Overall, this introduction sets the foundation for understanding the legal debate between these two frameworks. I will now pass my part to the next group member to explain the analysis in more detail.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. My name is Muhammad Naziman. My case number 303354. Today, I'm going to talk about Framework A. The main idea of this framework is very simple, which is countries are only legally bound by the rule they have officially signed and agreed to in a treaty. In international law, this is often called the Lotus Principle. It basically says that countries are free to do what they want unless there is a specific rule that says no. If there is no written law stopping a country from doing something, then that action is allowed. This means that for a country to be held responsible for climate change, it must have first agreed to a treaty that says it is responsible. There is a very important rule in law called Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. This rule uses the phrase "pacta sunt servanda", which is just a fancy way of saying agreement must be kept. The key point here is that treaties are like contracts, which means they only count for the people who sign them. So, if a country that produces a lot of pollution has not signed a specific climate treaty, Framework A says they do not have a legal duty to pay for any damage. They are only responsible for the promises they have actually made in writing. There are two big reasons why some people prefer Framework A. First, it provides legal certainty. Because the rules are written down in a treaty, every country knows exactly what they are required to do. There is no guessing or confusion. Second, it protects sovereignty. This means it protects a country's right to govern itself. It prevents a country from being forced to pay huge amounts of money or follow laws that they never actually accepted. This makes the system more predictable and easier for courts to manage because the obligations are very specific. However, Framework A has some big problems. The biggest weakness is the accountability gap. If a country is causing a lot of environmental harm but simply refuses to join a treaty, they can avoid all legal responsibility. They can basically hide from law by not signing the paper. Another problem is that this way is very slow. Negotiating and signing international treaties can take many years. For a place like State A, which is already suffering from climate change, waiting years for a treaty is just too slow. To summarize, while Framework A is very clear and stable, it often fails to provide justice when countries refuse to cooperate. That's all from me. Thank you.
This slide explains Framework B, which is based on the idea of customary responsibility for harm. Under this framework, states have a legal duty to prevent environmental harm, even if there is no specific treaty in place. This is based on customary international law and the no harm principle, which states that countries must not use their territory in a way that harms other states. One key strength of this framework is that it promotes accountability. States cannot avoid responsibility simply because they have not signed an agreement, especially when their action cause transboundary harm. However, there are also challenges. It is often difficult to prove to which state is responsible for environmental damage, especially in cases like climate change, where harm is created cumulatively. In addition, enforcement can be weaker because this framework depends on interpretation and evidence rather than clear written rules. To summarize, Framework B is more flexible and fair in holding states accountable, but it faces practical challenges in terms of proof and enforcement. The next slide will compare both frameworks in detail.
Okay, for my part, I will present the comparative analysis between two frameworks regarding state responsibility for climate change harms. Okay, first, Framework A, no legal obligations beyond treaties. This framework argues that a state can only be held responsible if it has explicitly agreed to a treaty or legal agreement. It is based on state consent and treaty obligations. However, this approach has several limitations because it ignores the development of customary international law and may create legal gaps and leaving vulnerable states without effective remedies for climate-related harms. On the other hand, Framework B, customary responsibility for harm, suggests that a state can also be held responsible under customary international law. This framework is supported by principles such as the no harm rule and due diligence, which require states to prevent activities within their territory from causing harms to other states. It is also supported by growing state practice and the increasing global consequences on climate responsibility. When we comparing these two frameworks, Framework B is considered strongest. This is because international law is not limited to treaties alone. It is also involved through customary norms and state practice. Furthermore, Framework B promotes greater justice and fairness by recognizing the responsibility of states whose actions contribute significantly to climate change.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Sharifah Sofia, matrix number 305584. On this part, I will be comparing Framework A and Framework B. Framework A is based on treaty law. States are only bound by obligations that they have agreed to through treaties. Because these obligations are clearly written, Framework A provides legal certainty and is easier to enforce. States know exactly what their responsibilities are. On the other hand, Framework B is based on customary international law. Under this framework, states can be held responsible for environmental harm, even without a specific treaty. Framework B reflects important environmental principles, such as preventing harm to other states and promoting sustainability development. Therefore, while Framework A focuses on legal certainty, Framework B focuses more on environmental responsibility. For the evaluation and conclusion, Framework B has several advantages. It promotes accountability and encourages states to take responsibility for environmental harm. It also reflects the growing importance of environmental protection in international law. However, Framework B faces enforcement challenges. It can be difficult to prove which states caused the damage, especially in cases such as climate changes and pollution. A state may also disagree on whether a customary rule exists, making enforcement more complicated. In conclusion, Framework A provides greater legal certainty and enforceability because it is based on treaty obligations. However, Framework B is fairer and more environmentally responsible because it holds states accountable for environmental harm beyond just formal agreements. Overall, Framework B offers a much more progressive approach to addressing global environmental challenges.
Next, I will talk about the final position and justification. So based on our research, we conclude that Framework B, which is based on customary international law, is the most appropriate approach to address state responsibility for transboundary environmental damage. So the main reason is that Framework B allows a state to be held responsible for environmental harm even without a specific international treaty. So it is based on established state practices and the recognition that these practices create legal obligations. So this framework is highly relevant today because environmental problems such as climate change, air pollution, forest fires, and marine pollution often affect countries beyond their borders. So for example, the 2015 haze caused by forest fires in Indonesia affected neighboring countries, including Malaysia and Singapore. So this shows that environmental damage in one country can have serious impact on others. A well-known example of Framework B is the Trail Smelter arbitration case between Canada and the United States. So the pollution from a smelter in Canada damaged agricultural land in the United States. So the tribunal ruled that a state must not use its territory in a way that causes environmental harm to another state. So this case became an important foundation for state responsibility in international environmental law. Another advantage of Framework B is that it promotes fairness and shared responsibility among states. So countries cannot avoid responsibility simply because there is no treaty in place. So it also helps protect the rights of future generations to enjoy a healthy environment. So compared to Framework A, which relies on treaties, Framework B is more flexible and adaptable. Although Framework A provides clearer rules, it depends on countries agreeing on and signing treaties, which can be a slow process. So Framework B, on the other hand, can respond more effectively to new environmental challenges through state practice and international court decisions. So the conclusion that I can do for this part is Framework B is the most suitable approach because it is more practical, flexible, and relevant to today's global environmental issues. So it strengthens state accountability and supports international cooperation in protecting the environment.